record, and we're live. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gorman Lee. I am the co-chair for the Northeast Regional Virtual Conference for the Social Studies, or NERCVirtual, as we call it. Today is our first day. This is our kickoff weekend. For the whole month of October and into November, we are offering a number of webinars, workshops, and masterclasses, all virtually, online, through Zoom. And yeah, so today and tomorrow, as our kickoff for this virtual conference, we have a number of awesome, outstanding speakers talking on various topics, from underrepresented voices in American history to preparing our students to hold the office of citizen, and also just teaching and learning in the age of COVID and racial reckoning. And so we have a great lineup. Right now, we are going to be listening to Dan Osborn, who is from Primary Source and based out in Watertown. He is a scholar on many topics, particularly on multicultural and culturally relevant approaches in teaching social studies, learning social studies. Are you still a professor at Dean College? Or?
I do, yeah. I teach there part-time.
Right, so he teaches there part-time, and you were also, when I first met you, you were with Facing History and Ourselves.
I was, yeah.
So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Dan Osborn. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Gorman. I really appreciate it. So, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be joining you today at NERC 2020. I'd be remiss if I didn't begin by acknowledging the circumstances of our convening this year. 2020 has been a year that has given the world pause. All the tumult and uncertainty of this year has demanded that we reflect on so many disparate features of life, locally and across the world. So I will not list in exhaustive detail the litany of nascent and long-term problems that manifested themselves this year. We're all steeped in these realities. And even the format that brings us together today is its own reminder of the paradigm shifts that mark this year. But to narrow our scope to the world of education, one which we operate in and are all deeply invested in, there have been a number of changes to schooling this past year. In many ways, they were abrupt and unforeseen. For months, we all felt like we were simply engaging in acts of triage, trying to make sense of a crisis. Teachers, students, administrators, and communities modified their understandings of the form and procedures of learning. These adjustments happened slowly, then suddenly, and we continue to test what is effective in maintaining a level of educational opportunity that serves the needs of all students. This has at its core questions regarding equity and access, along with the meaning and relevance of what we teach. I want to channel this spirit and focus it on history and social studies education. If we continue to pause and reflect, perhaps we can imagine visions of history and social studies that expand the scope of our current practice. Maybe we will reaffirm and reinforce the directions we're headed. But rather than simply accepting the status quo, let's take this time to consider what it is that we strive to do in this work and the ways we can weave together some of the various practices in the world of history and social studies into a coherent whole. Today, I'd like to focus on a problem that has confounded history and social studies since its inception. This problem is that of competing visions. At times, different frameworks for social studies exist parallel to one another, meaning that they may be practiced concurrently without necessarily intersecting. At times, these visions are actually divergent from one another. Often, definitions of what should be taught and how it should be taught compete with one another. This does not have to be the case. In fact, I contend that there is an amplifying effect when seemingly discrete visions of history and social studies are actually woven together. For those of you living in Massachusetts, and working on implementing our new framework, you may have civic education at the forefront of your mind. Teaching for active participation in democratic society is likely a vision of education that has come to dominate your thinking and recast the purpose and process of your teaching. I contend that this need not replace or displace other visions of history and social studies. Instead, there's a symbiosis between social studies for the development of students' civic agency with other visions of the social studies. This entire discourse of what to emphasize and what visions to promote exists within the recent attempts to establish a more inclusive society. Sometimes these efforts focus on schools. Other times they're directed towards the cultural curriculum or the teaching and learning that occurs when messages and values are sent through celebrations, rituals, and public acts in social settings. We are living in a moment of profound cultural change and demands for shifts in representation that deconstruct what is currently dominant. There's people who are asking us to recenter narratives and perspectives that have previously been displaced. The events of 2020 come on the heels of a recent effort to challenge acts of commemoration in public places, in particular monuments. This year, we've seen momentum developing around this reckoning with who is on display, who's put on pedestals, and who we literally and figuratively are asked to look up to. The activism around monuments is a reminder that bronze and marble are not simply inanimate objects, but are strategically placed to lionize historical figures, and that these individuals serve as cultural shorthands. They become the embodiment of values and ideals. They're presented to the public as exemplars and inspirations, but many are asking at what cost and at whose cost? The discourse and activism around racial justice that we're seeing today does not start or end with questions of memory and commemoration, holidays and heroes. In 2020, we are in the throes of a reckoning with racial injustice and violence. This is not the first time American society has attempted to confront racism and oppression. Yet this summer was a galvanizing event that promoted widespread and sustained protests and calls for structural change and reform. However, as people demand change in the way the past is remembered and racial violence and oppression are dealt with in the present, there has been pushback. There are detractors. These movements are not universally endorsed. This summer may have seen the toppling of monuments and demands for a new pantheon to be widely embraced in the United States. It may have seen activism and a renewed social movement. Yet it also saw attempts to derail and delegitimize these processes, particularly when it comes to history and the treatment of the past in public spaces and classroom settings. All of these events unfolding around us today pose existential questions that are necessary for history and social studies educators to ask again and again. There is no time like now to pose them. What narratives are dominant in our classrooms? Which narratives are silenced, and why is this? What communities are represented in the curriculum we teach? How are they represented, and why is this? What is the relationship between the narratives told, the way people are represented, and the perceptions and treatment of marginalized peoples across the world? What role can the content, pedagogy, and culture of the classroom play in casting a light on and in its own way addressing injustice and inequality at home and across the world? These are profound questions that get to the heart of what we teach, why we teach, and how students come to see and interact with their social world. Implicit in our practices are questions of selection, emphasis and de-emphasis, privilege and power. These are all to be dealt with in order to contribute to learning experiences that elevate and empower students. I'd like to add a couple more existential questions to that list as well. In their own way, they're the sort that animate our work with students. what is the purpose of remembering the past and examining the complex facets of society? How are historical narratives constructed? What's the relationship between memory and identity? Who has the power to elevate a narrative as dominant in a nation's collective consciousness? I do not speak today assuming there's anything particularly unique about the tensions between those who are wishing to critique and deconstruct dominant expressions of collective memory in schools and society, and those who consider this to be unpatriotic and anti-American. We only have to look at the 1990s, when the national history standards were defeated because the attempt to normalize a more inclusive form of education was cast as, quote, the end of history, politicized, and politically correct. At roughly the same time, the Smithsonian was under attack for its planned exhibit on the Enola Gay and the use of atomic bombs during World War II. Both of these attempts to shift narratives, include different perspectives, and question the dominant interpretation of the past were subsumed into the culture wars of the time. So it is in many ways a perennial debate to question the purpose of the past, wonder about why the past is invoked, and challenge the messages that are embedded within historical memory. There has never truly been a consensus regarding the purpose of history and social studies education. From the decision made by teachers in their individual classrooms to the agendas set by the National Council for the Social Studies, our discipline and practice tend to be in flux and also subject to competing interests. In the 1970 presidential address offered by Shirley Engel at NCSS, Engel offered a retrospective on the meaning of social studies since the inception of the National Council in the 1920s. Engel reviewed roughly 50 years of evolving visions of social studies education. 50 years removed from that presidential address, we continue to have this conversation. This is not a matter easily resolved or permanently fixed. At times, social studies education saw its mission as the instillment of disciplinary knowledge for the sake of good citizenship. At other times, that emphasis on civics actually waned. As Ronald Evans, social studies education scholar, wrote, quote, the history of social studies is a story of turf wars among competing camps, each with its own leaders, philosophy, beliefs, and pedagogical practices, end quote. At times, history and social studies has had different objectives and emphases, which were the basis of the undercurrents propelling the curriculum forward. The social studies have been anchored to civics and citizenship education. More recently, progressive iterations have focused on ethnic studies, diversity, multiculturalism, and global perspectives, with an emphasis on non-Western people and places. But these shifts have, at times, felt like whiplash for the teacher trying to get a firm grasp on the objectives of their own teaching. And when posed that inevitable question by students, why are we studying this? The answer is not always self-evident or without contention. Today, with questions of racial injustice, a global pandemic that does not know or respect the borders of nation states, and students learning through hybrid and virtual means, it's worth thinking about the turf wars that Ronald Evans mentions. Does it actually have to be this way? Are proponents of civics the Sharks and advocates of multiculturalism the Jets? Do history and social studies theorists and practitioners have to select a camp at the expense of others? As we think about civic education and all the content and skill development that is required to foster students' capacity to be active, informed, and empowered participants in democratic life, do we have to jettison other ways to imagine content, to imagine pedagogy, and to practice the culture of the classroom? I do not believe that these are mutually exclusive goals. There are intersections and commonalities between civic education and many other contending visions of social studies that can collectively and in an amplifying manner challenge normative and exclusionary learning experiences and equip students with the knowledge and skills to understand and appreciate pluralism, diversity, global interconnectedness, and to affirm their identities in the classroom and across society as people who have worth, value, and the potential to meaningfully contribute to the world. At the heart of this effort to look beyond turf wars and competing visions is this question: how can history and social studies classrooms empower students to cultivate their critical consciousness while activating their agency as civic participants capable of thriving in a pluralistic and globally interconnected world? In answering this question, I hope to present an understanding of the impetus animating the push for multicultural education, global education, and culturally relevant pedagogy, while making the case for their fundamental relevance and compatibility with civic education, so that history and social studies can take these disparate movements and discontinue the long-standing ebb and flow from one to the other, in favor instead of a multifaceted and compelling classroom experience that is premised upon amplifying rather than negating the objectives of each of these movements. So much of the debates around what narrative we teach takes for granted the nature of knowledge production, particularly when it comes to historical knowledge. By better understanding the nature of historical knowledge production, we can understand the thrust behind each of these movements that I focus on and the way they critique and seek to remedy dominant historical thinking and classroom practice in social studies and history education. Let's look at 3 statements about history as a discipline. So let's start with Keith Jenkins. Quote, "The past that we know is always contingent upon our own views, our own present." Jenkins reminds us that historical knowledge is never absolute or objective truth because it is actually filtered and constructed by the historian, contingent upon the whims of time and place. Quote, "Every historical narrative has as its latent or manifest purpose the desire to moralize the events of which it treats," end quote. Hayden White reminds us that by turning the cacophony of the past into a coherent narrative, values are imposed and stories emerge that are the product of imposing logic and order. Quote, "History can no longer legitimately be viewed as simply or merely a matter of the discovery of the story of the past, the detection of which will tell us what it means." Munslow reminds us that we select, arrange, and emphasize in the effort to make meaning rather than to reveal meaning. So what does this mean? There's a power in the act of constructing knowledge. This power is possessed by historians and history and social studies teachers alike. Those who produce knowledge and present it as neutral truth are part of this process of offering interpretations, but too often present interpretation as an absolute form of truth. In short, a particular version of the past becomes conflated with the past, as though they're actually one and the same. In turn, the process of meaning making becomes understood as the revelation of meaning that's self-evident, as opposed to the construction of meaning that is contingent. By shifting away from a more positivistic stance of historical knowledge towards one that sees history as contingent and positional, we can avoid elevating one particular narrative as dominant. We can expand our collective memory and shift our historical consciousness so that the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion are not so rigidly bound. While we may wish to think of history and social studies education as being an edifying experience that has understanding and critical thinking as its core objectives, this has not always been the case. In fact, history education has traditionally been one of the primary vehicles for the construction of national identities. In this way, the school has served as a site of instilling pride, patriotism, and seeing American history through the lenses of progress and exceptionalism. Benedict Anderson reminds us that nations are imagined communities. They are not the products of nature. They are not biological. Nationhood is constructed and internalized. For Anderson, the decline of religion in society and the advent of printing and literacy engendered the ascent of nationhood as the primary form of collective identification across the world. Anderson sees the daily act of consuming newspapers as binding people to a ritual and a ceremony that is based around language, communication, and storytelling. I suggest that the newspaper exists as one of many forms of using stories to foster a sense of belonging to the nation. History education is very much a part of this process. Because schooling is compulsory and its content traditionally codified and afforded a sense of legitimacy, it is generally understood that the interpretations of the past in this setting are conduits for identity formation. Mario Carretero, in his book on the relationship between history education and national identity formation, writes, quote, "School-taught history is both much more and also much less than academic history. It is much more because it includes a large array of values that are linked in a weft of historical narratives whose primary objective is the formation of a positive image, a triumphant, progress-oriented one, even messianic in some cases, of the nation's identity," end quote. In discussing the purpose of history and schooling, he also writes, quote, "It is an official institution whose function is to ideologically and cognitively form very young students who are highly versatile," end quote. To Ronald Evans, this is about transmitting to students culture and myth, patriotism, and a conventional and conservative notion of good citizenship. It includes an approach focused on heroes, discovery, and morality tales. Without actually assuming that textbooks are the primary vehicle in classrooms for historical knowledge, they do serve as a convenient shorthand for appreciating the narratives and representations that come to epitomize a nationalistic, often sanitized, and historically exclusionary form of history education that plays a central role in national identity formation. A cursory glance at the covers of these textbooks leaves a lasting impression of the types of people and stories that are central to the project of nation building through history education. We see white men, political elites, and those who operated the levers of government power as prominent. When symbols rather than people adorn the covers of these books, we see that they are ones that are associated with liberty and even have liberty in their name, such as the Statue of Liberty and the Liberty Bell. Absent is an overt and immediately identifiable version of history education that is diverse, equitable in representation, critical in orientation, and transformative in nature. When history is presented to students as truth rather than interpretation, when one narrative among many becomes dominant, when these narratives are put into the service of nation building, and when pride-inducing and patriotic versions of the past are exclusionary, this has profound implications for our students, particularly those who do not see themselves on display. Almost 100 years ago, Carter G. Woodson wrote, quote, "In history, of course, the Negro has no place in this curriculum. He was pictured as a human being of the lower order, unable to subject passion to reason, and therefore useful only when made the hewer of wood and the drawer of water for others," end quote. Woodson's seminal text, The Miseducation of the Negro, addressed the conspicuous absence of Africa and African Americans in formal history education. He lamented the message sent to Black people when they appeared to have no stories to tell and no value in the overall human experience. More recently, Bell Hooks observed, quote, "Opening a magazine or book, turning on the television set, watching a film, or looking at photographs in public spaces, we are most likely to see images of Black people that reinforce and reinscribe white supremacy. Those images may be constructed by white people who have not divested of racism, or by people of color, Black people, who may see the world through the lens of white supremacy, internalized racism. Their observations inform us of the emotional, psychological, and social detriment that result from a lack of representation and from misrepresentation. When marginalized communities do not see themselves in historical narratives or appear to be lacking agency within them, they're cast into the role of the other, and otherness is premised upon a hierarchy. The true nature of the other is minimized and concealed behind a false depiction that they are monolithic communities. As such, their actual plurality is denied. They appear to possess essential qualities. As such, their dynamism is denied. This can be exoticizing and dehumanizing. The classroom has played a role in othering marginalized communities through the trend for history and social studies education to be part of a nation-building exercise. This observation is the basis of multicultural, global, and culturally relevant pedagogies as visions of education that are oriented away from reinforcing dominant and normative forms of education towards those that offer a more just and equitable form of schooling. These observations are compatible with civic education. Again, it's worth underscoring that the messages communicated through narratives, when they are exclusionary, they actually enable othering to occur, and they have lasting implications for marginalized and privileged communities alike. Fanon reminds us that the colonized, who are subjected to messages that preclude any meaningful and substantive recognition of their humanity and agency, suffer as a consequence of this. Fanon sees the development of inferiority complexes through the internalization of racism that is conveyed through formal and informal curricular messages. Regarding white students and those who are privileged, D'Angelo reminds us of the danger of perceptions of self and other when whiteness appears to be the default. When white becomes the ideal, it is difficult for those who benefit from this framework to see and understand the experiences of those who are not beneficiaries of this sort of social framework. In 2020, we are living in a moment when the struggles of Black Americans are centered. Du Bois posed the provocative question, how does it feel to be a problem? And this question resonates with us today, all the years after he posed it. It has also been co-opted by Arab Americans who themselves also feel the weight of underrepresentation, misrepresentation, and marginalization within American society. So what can be done in schools to rehumanize the diverse communities who have been made to feel like a problem by the manifold sources of American society? How can these efforts empower students and contribute to, rather than conflict with, the contemporary trend towards civic education? Critically interrogating schools and the content and practices of history and social studies education is fundamental to shifting away from the exclusionary and damaging dynamics that Woodson, Hooks, Fanon, D'Angelo, Du Bois, and so many others continually remind us exist and are deeply rooted in society. It is the impetus behind so many of the visions of history and social studies education that have emerged and continue to struggle to become normalized within schools. Education scholar Michael Apple reminds us that part of developing an educational reality that benefits all students starts with disavowing a claim that is prevalent in schools, that knowledge is neutral. Apple writes, quote, "The knowledge that now gets into schools is already a choice from a much larger universe of possible social knowledge and principles. It is a form of cultural capital." Relatedly, Paulo Freire informs us that education does not need to be about transmission. Students are not receptacles. The classroom is not a space for depositing knowledge into passive students. If it is, then students are denied the right to understand the nature of historical knowledge as a constructed discourse. Instead, they're asked to see it as an objective truth. An alternative vision of schooling is that of critical consciousness formation. For Freire, developing a critical consciousness is liberating because it invites students to interrogate reality rather than receive it. It is a pedagogy towards humanity because it is transformative and how students think, what they are empowered to think about, and how they see themselves in relation to curriculum and society. Philosopher of education Henry Giroux explains that critical pedagogy hinges on the language of hope. By being critical ourselves as teachers and inviting students to be critical as thinkers, it becomes possible to imagine that power does not necessarily have to reinforce dominant narratives and forms of education that exclude, marginalize, and fail to address the social questions that are swirling around in the world today. Instead, Giroux reminds us that critical pedagogy and the language of hope reorient power towards justice, equality, and freedom. He writes that pedagogy often reproduces reality by, quote, erasing any trace of subaltern histories, class struggle, and racial and gender inequalities and injustices, end quote. Yet often, we as educators wish to be the ones leading the charge in dismantling the oppressive forces in schools and society. We put the ethnocentric textbook back on the shelf. We do the hard work of employing our critical consciousness to deconstruct and evaluate dominant narratives in order to jettison what is problematic in favor of what is inclusive, diverse, equitable, and justice-oriented. But this is not necessarily an ideal pedagogy. In doing so, we may deny our students the opportunity themselves to be the ones that are critically interrogating knowledge and activating their agency as critical thinkers who can critique, deliberate, and transform. Teachers should not monopolize the responsibility of meaning making. There is room for students to develop their critical consciousness by them being the ones deconstructing and positing alternatives to what is taught and who is represented and what the classroom experience feels like. They can co-construct multicultural, global, and culturally relevant learning spaces when they are active participants and there's reciprocity in these processes. In this way, students are empowered to problematize and replace rather than passively receive. Teachers possess a power that can reinforce traditional forms of history education or present a progressive alternative. Yet in either instance, the teacher possesses the power and the student receives the interpretation. What if students become party to the deliberations of normalizing knowledge, fully participating and in turn bearing witness to and acting out the processes of selecting and deliberating, a process too often reserved for those who select memories and representations that become the basis of history and social studies education? What would history look like if commentators like Woodson and Hooks were to have their grievances heard? We have examples of reimagined history. However, their existence is insufficient so long as they are not embedded within the mainstream. When they are the counter narratives rather than the mainstream narratives, schooling continues to privilege and favor at the expense of the communities whose contributions to the United States and the world remain neglected. Dashibi pushes us as teachers to shift intellectual history away from Eurocentrism. When we teach in such a way that students only think of Europe as enlightened, the rest of the world appears devoid of philosophy and thought. We can reframe intellectual history with our students so that the Enlightenment becomes subsumed into a more expansive teaching of humanity's life of the mind on a more global scale. Takaki offers us a vision of a cosmopolitan and diverse retelling of American history, one that normalizes the notion of America as a mosaic. Malik gives us a template for Malik gives us a template for seeing America through one community's eyes, rather than attempting to use the classroom as a space to articulate a meta-narrative. Ansari takes these efforts and globalizes the approach by conceiving of world history through an Islamic lens. In this way, Islam and Muslims are not positioned as a chapter, but instead the very basis for understanding world history. It's worth asking what underpins these books and the approaches found within them. Why may they be templates for our own version of history and social studies education that is premised on weaving together multicultural, global, and culturally relevant approaches to teaching history? What do they say about empowering students to cultivate and activate their critical consciousness? What basis does this have in weaving together such visions of education with civic education in order to avoid the turf wars of negation and competition? These texts and the approaches they offer respond to the dominant narratives that Woodson, Hooks, and so many others have lamented and critiqued. They address the disparities in representation, thereby correcting the messages in classrooms regarding whose identities matter and whose contributions are deserving of attention in a codified, normalized curricular experience. They're premised upon the work of multicultural and global approaches to education. These premises can be made compatible with the goals of civic learning so that there's an amplifying effect to identifying the intersections between what otherwise is presented as parallel or divergent forms of history and social studies education. The work of James Banks is often presented as the cornerstone of multicultural education. However, I would like to call attention to the framework presented in the work of Carl Grant. In doing so, I wish to reclaim multiculturalism from the negative connotations as translating into simply little more than holidays and heroes in the classroom. Multiculturalism has been disparaged as simply tacking on diversity through a lesson here, a unit there, and an occasional and incomplete form of cultural celebration. For Grant, multicultural education is dynamic and always evolving. It had its origins in the intercultural movement, intergroup movement, the civil rights movement, and ethnic studies movement. In this way, it is a template for us in determining how to meld and weave rather than pivot from one framework to another. For Grant, multicultural education constitutes both a philosophy and a process. As a philosophy, it is grounded in democracy, social justice, equity, and an affirmation of diversity. Note the seeds of its compatibility with civic education already. As a process, it is fluid. It must undergo modification in order to meet the ever-changing needs of society. In this way, multiculturalism can avoid becoming defunct if it's not static. Looking at previous movements, like those articulated in the presidential addresses at NCSS, we see lots of clunky vestiges that seem out of touch with 21st century sensibilities. Yet Grant offers a way to avoid presenting multicultural education as just another trend in an unending barrage of trends that have their day and then depart. Perhaps unchanging in multicultural education is its unwavering critique of allowing schools to be monocultural havens that emphasize Eurocentric content. In its origins, multicultural education was born to address racism. However, it has since expanded to include sexism, classism, and handicapism. This has resulted in a more inclusive coalescing of different interests into one movement for social justice in schools. Whether it's combating racism or sexism, for instance, multiculturalism recognizes the problems of an assimilationist approach to education, whereby students of diverse backgrounds are subjected to learning that demotes their identities in favor of gaining acceptance into mainstream society. Multiculturalism, as the name suggests, champions pluralism over singularity and values students' identities because of, not in spite of, their differences. In this way, it is concerned with oppression in all of its manifestations and challenges the distortions and omissions in school by ensuring the complexity of group identity is central to learning rather than marginal. Multicultural education is also fundamentally invested in student-teacher relationships, not just the curriculum. By affirming identity, promoting teachers' reflection on attitudes about race and gender, for example, it is designed to promote teacher-student interactions that push back against oppression and alienation in schools, while empowering students to act authentically and with intentionality from a position of cultural affirmation. Multicultural education is also a form of social justice education. They're not fundamentally separate. This orientation on social justice within multicultural education allows for the practices of democracy to permeate classroom experiences. By encouraging students to analyze their own life circumstances and develop the skills for social action, students are invited through this form of history and social studies education to harness their positive self-concept for the critique and improvement of school and society. Embedded within this are the skills for active civic participation, so fundamental to a student-centered form of civic learning that is garnering attention today in Massachusetts and across the nation. For all the strengths of multicultural education, it continues to focus primarily on the diversity within the United States. Global education takes up this torch, the torch of the vision of multicultural education, and expands the scope to avoid decentering the world while recentering the marginalized within the United States. Global learning in history and social studies is premised on the understanding that the United States does not exist in isolation, and that students in classrooms today live in a world that is interconnected through digital telecommunications and transportation systems that make people across the globe accessible and relevant for the social, cultural, political, and economic world that students in our classrooms inhabit. At the heart of global education is the push to include content beyond the United States and Europe in schools, so that students can see misunderstood peoples and those who are neglected in the curriculum as dynamic and pluralistic. Moreover, by emphasizing interconnectedness as reciprocal exchange, global content and approaches to learning help students see the peoples of the world as constantly hybridizing and diffusing cultural influences. In this way, it pushes back against stereotypes and notions of US superiority. It pushes back against a thesis that there's a clash between civilizations, between the West and the rest. Such an approach is designed to expand students' consciousness beyond the temporal constraints of the here and now. If multicultural education challenges racism and bigotry at home, global approaches to teaching and learning aim to reduce ethnocentrism and xenophobia by affirming and validating those who have been assigned the role of the global other. Both multicultural and global education are invested in pedagogy. However, they're most often associated with curriculum reform. If we are to think explicitly about pedagogy, the processes of learning, and the classroom dynamic, we can see that culturally relevant and sustaining approaches amplify our objective of identifying the commonalities and complementary nature rather than the competing nature of these approaches to history and social studies education. Ladson Billings labeled culturally relevant teaching as a pedagogy of opposition because it accomplishes, as we've discussed earlier in our time together, an act of critiquing and deconstructing the status quo regarding what is taught, valued, and emphasized in schools. It couples that critical disposition with a shift away from the individual and their academic achievement towards collective empowerment in schools. Culturally relevant teaching is about cultural competence. It strives to maintain cultural integrity in the face of assimilationism and erasure. It sees culture as a vehicle rather than an obstacle for learning. When students are introduced to classroom settings that emphasize their cultural identities and their modes of expression, the classroom becomes less alienating. Oppression is countered with liberation. The monocultural version of schooling is challenged, and students are invited to be themselves and see themselves in the classroom. This is all compatible with the critical consciousness and transformative approaches we discussed earlier when thinking about Paulo Freire. Ladson-Billings sees culturally responsive pedagogy as promoting a, quote, broader socio-political consciousness that allows them, students, to critique cultural norms, values, mores, and institutions that produce and maintain social inequities, end quote. Django Paris demands that we as teachers sustain culture rather than simply make it relevant in the classroom. This is a proactive step towards defending, promoting, and allowing culture to thrive. Paris sees this as an act that, quote, perpetuates and fosters cultural pluralism as part of the democratic project of schooling, end quote. All of this, in short, means that schools can become places where students' community practices and ways of being are valued in ways that are not Pollyanna, tacked on, footnotes, or afterthoughts. Multicultural, global, and culturally relevant education are complementary with one another in ways that are fairly apparent. Yet they can appear divergent or even interfering with the civic learning and other contemporary emphases that are found in schools today. Civics may be synonymous to some with teaching founding documents and principles, discussing the American Revolution, thinking about political systems and institutions, emphasizing acts such as voting, and thinking about how bills become a law. Yet civics is so much more than that. Civics is about the way people participate in society and governance. Civic learning is about fostering the development of skills, knowledge, and dispositions for active and informed participation in democratic life. This requires students to recognize their power, use their agency, and harness their voice in addressing issues and problems impacting themselves, their communities, and those beyond themselves and their communities. Multiculturalism emphasizes social justice and social change. Culturally relevance emphasizes democratic experiences that value community and champion an equitable sense of we the people. They each focus on questions of equity, access, justice, and fairness. These are questions that are at the heart of civic life and the foundational questions students are grappling with when they're embedded in their own civics classrooms. They ask students to critically interrogate the world as it is today, diagnose the issues that impinge on a full sense of belonging, a full sense of humanity, and they translate those questions, observations, and critiques into a course of action that is more inclusive and equitable in terms of the voices, experiences, and representations that are considered deserving of attention and made normative in school. This is, at its core, an exercise in civic learning. Civics, particularly the iteration that is currently gaining momentum and which emphasizes action civics, is fundamentally about having students identify problems, present alternatives, and advocate for change. The commonalities between multicultural education, global education, and culturally relevant pedagogy with civic education is that they all ask, each in their own way, in a compatible way, who is included in we the people? What is our social compact? Whose interests are served and whose interests are not being served? Who is currently empowered and who is not? And what can we do about it? These are fundamentally about democratizing schools in terms of content, pedagogy, and culture to empower all members of the learning community to engage with their experiences and have their identities affirmed and have their agency part of the learning experience of our classrooms. The turf wars in social studies can be paralyzing and very confusing. It is a whiplash-inducing experience when one trend is replaced by another trend. Instead of seeing one vision of history and social studies education as a panacea and all others as a distraction to its full implementation, we can, from within this marketplace that I've described, weave together different visions, and establish history and social studies that decolonize knowledge, break silences, elevate the standing of marginalized histories, and recenter displaced narratives through learning experiences that are relevant, affirming, and sustainable. Learning experiences that help our students see themselves as active, empowered, and capable individuals. All of this is necessary for civic education. Civic participation cannot be accomplished without a critical consciousness. And people cannot thrive in a democratic society if they feel excluded, ignored, and undervalued. Civic learning often looks like this. But what if civic learning looked more like this? This is no less about democracy and participation. However, it is much more vibrant and pluralistic, equitable and representative of American pluralism and global diversity. And in its own way, it puts to rest some of the questions that arise again and again about the turf wars in history and social studies education. That's it for me. I'm going to pause, drink my tea, and thank everybody for sticking with me through that.
Thank you, Dan. If anyone has any questions, I think someone posted a question, and if you want to ask Dan directly, I can unmute you if that's okay. If not, I can read the question from the chat, but I'm gonna ask them to unmute, see if you wanted to speak. Can you try? Her internet is pretty unstable. Okay, so her comment and question is she'd love to hear your ideas on getting kids to be part of the process, which you kind of alluded to in your presentation, but how about like the resources on this process for teachers to be able to, get started in that sense?
Yeah, so much of this is about redistributing power in the classroom. And that sounds great, but that also doesn't sound very concrete and tangible. Inquiry-based learning is one way to make this happen. Research is one way to make this happen. Rather than assigning students the topic that they have to research and giving them the set of materials, introducing and affording space for students' own curiosities, their own concerns, and the issues that are animating their thoughts as they reflect on society and themselves in the world, that is a way to bring it into the classroom. So it might result in a learning experience that seems less familiar in that it could be less structured, semi-structured, and have a lot more autonomy in what learning looks like. But that's a way to ensure that students aren't on the receiving end of all the thought that's gone into teaching and learning that they weren't a part of. So if we can find ways to ask questions that bring students into the attempt to orient ourselves towards learning, that's a fundamental way to do that. And that's really about choice and opportunity to have their choices affirmed by a teacher who encourages students to go in directions that may not necessarily be found in a curriculum map or be predetermined by a teacher. So it might feel a little awkward or intimidating because there's a lot of uncertainty in that. But through inquiry, through research and investigation, and though you can have learning experiences that allow students to bring themselves into it. Those are more of the long-term and larger processes. But on a smaller scale, on a regular scale, the sorts of questions you pose in an activator, the sorts of questions you pose in an exit slip, that can be a way in real time, in a short, small, and manageable way to get students' feedback, to bring their voice into the planning process. And that can be the sort of way that students are able to, if they feel comfortable or not comfortable disclosing openly, share their thinking with a teacher, have it written down, documented, and then that can become part of the process of channeling learning in one direction or another.
Yeah, and then Anne responded, thank you. She oftentimes gives students the freedom to generate questions to guide our learning, but the questions do not always lead to deeper learning, and that's where she seems to struggle.
Yeah, I would say that it's inquiry-based learning is one mechanism through which this can happen because it's iterative. It doesn't start and end with a first round of questions, but that's a launching pad into a process where students may not necessarily know how to orient themselves. So we may give students more autonomy to say what they want to learn about and how they want to see themselves and their communities reflected in the classroom. But we can also have a framework with benchmarks, with learning objectives, with kind of steps along the way to ensure that we're spiraling back to what was that first question, what have we learned, where have you gone, and what can we do to deepen our learning, to deepen what we know, to ensure that we don't stall out along the way. So I think benchmarks and an iterative process really ensure that we capture deep learning while transforming classrooms away from a teacher-centric approach to selecting and determining what's taught, how it's taught, and to whom it's taught.
Great. So, thinking about, what you've been talking about, what you've been presenting, there are two levels. Well, maybe there are more levels, but the primary level that we speak of is within the classroom, right? It's the teacher having the, I want to say, maybe to a certain extent, autonomy to be able to kind of channel students to inquiry-based learning, thinking about the kinds of resources that they can bring into the classroom. The other level that I constantly think of, because this is where I'm currently at, is at a district level, at an administrator's level. Thinking about, as like for me, myself, I have a little bit of, I don't know, what's the word? I'm more in charge of supervising the curriculum in itself, from elementary to high school. So asking for other curriculum directors or principals even, what do you recommend beginning approaches to expand social studies learning from, let's say, a Eurocentric to, that traditional understanding of what history is to a more multicultural, what has been your experience talking to school districts about approaches to expanding the definition of multiculturalism, but also global and culturally relevant approaches?
Yeah, I think what I've often seen in my work, and like you, Gorman, I work at kind of a macro level where I'm not in the classroom, I'm not thinking about my daily interactions with students, but I'm thinking more so about what's happening in a school, a district, in a state, and sometimes even beyond that. And what I see oftentimes is an endorsement of these ideas. A lot of teachers kind of snapping along and saying, I love where you're coming from, it's great, but I don't have administrative support, I don't have time, I don't have resources, I don't know this history myself, and I'll concede that I was a product of a K-12 learning that really did not emphasize much of what I'm talking about. So in my adult life, in my professional life, I had to revisit what was not taught and to make up for the dearth of exposure I had when I was younger. And I think we often stall out when we realize that we have the will, but perhaps not always the requisite knowledge. We have the desire and we understand the theory, but the practice just seems so esoteric and not easy to really identify. I think part of this is long-term thinking. We might want this week or next month or this school year to transform what we do, get these voices into the classroom, make for a much more dynamic and innovative approach to teaching that builds on what we're already doing. But focusing on the immediacy of what we can do next week or next term doesn't always lend itself to sustainable structural change. So I think long-term thinking, and figuring out who to bring on in that process. So we could have it be a hierarchical kind of top-down approach where people who are in central office positions or directors or chairs or department heads, where they're thinking about these questions and then the ideas trickle down. I think if we think long-term and bottom up and not just top down, we can invite in our students, their parents, community members, scholars, advocates, experts, members of the communities in question we want to describe, and actually have the conversation with them. That becomes a longer, messier, more complicated process, but it's also one where the way in which we determine what we're selecting is itself equitable, is itself representative of what we want to see in the classroom. And that can allow for more bridges being built between school and community, between classroom and that which exists around it, that which we're preparing students to enter into with the capacity to contribute in a meaningful way. So changing our time frame, thinking about what are we going to do this year, next year, 5 years from now, thinking about who are our partners and our allies in this process, and how can we listen as much as we speak in the process of determining which directions to go with our curriculum and our school culture. That is really part of it. And again, I think feedback loops are so crucial. Having students actually share with us in some manner that we can measure and actually assess, analyze how they're feeling, what the school culture is like from their perspective. And not just getting that for the sake of feeling good about getting it, but getting that feedback from students and beyond so that we know what is actually happening, so that we're not doing the very things that Fanon or Hooks or all these people I reference are saying are problematic about school and society. Let's get their feedback, let's factor it into our decision making, and make sure that the voices of students and communities are constantly and consistently heard in the planning process.
Great, thank you. Jonathan had a question. Jonathan, do you think I can unmute you and maybe you can ask the question you typed in the chat?
Yeah, so I was just wondering if you had any recommendations for a book study amongst staff at a school to enhance multicultural education.
Yeah, so in preparation for today, I went through my stack of books, and I'll just show you some of what made its way into my talk today. So Henry Giroux' critical pedagogy is really something that informs a lot of my thinking. To be honest, I think is your concern about content? What is your primary concern? Are you just thinking you want to learn about the topics and peoples in question, or do you want to learn more about the framework and the theory behind multicultural and the other approaches I mentioned?
It's just more to bring, I guess, more of a multicultural approach to all classes within the building. I'm an administrator, so I'm looking to really enhance the knowledge of the teachers in all realms, not just social studies.
Yep. So yeah, I think if you were to focus just on the content, all the writings by Ronald Takaki serve as really great examples of the sorts of kind of concrete examples of what multiculturalism looks like when it becomes a curricular practice. However, there's no short supply of writings by people like Carl Grant, James Banks, Christian Sleater, who the three of them plus a wealth of other people all do a great job of not writing really esoteric academic stuff, but having these really short, succinct articles, 3 to 5 pages in length, that just enumerate in 5 bullet points, these are the principles of multiculturalism. Nice. And in doing so, they do a wonderful job of saying it's about curriculum, it's about school culture, it's about equity, it's about student voice, it's about X, Y, and Z. And starting with some of those shorter pieces, they provide a foundation for what is the framework, and they do so in a great way, which is that they don't say, and this only exists in the social studies classroom. None of these thinkers are thinking just about one discipline and one academic experience. They think about the school, and they see the school in interdisciplinary ways. So I would again say James Banks, Carl Grant, their writings, particularly their short essays for lay audiences, as opposed to the more kind of like hard-hitting, heady, peer-reviewed stuff, would be a great place to speak, or a great place to start. Sorry. If you wanted to, and I don't know, I didn't put my email address on my title slide, but Gorman, if you wanted to share with people my email address, I'd be much more willing to put some thought into this and give you a better response than what just happens to be on the top of my mind right now.
Yeah, actually, if you go to, let me see if I can, I'll put it into the chat, but for future reference, if you go to the Mass Council's website and you go to the to Dan's page on the NERCVirtual program, his email is on there. So you can always email him, but let me see if I can bring this over here and I'll put this in the chat as I'm doing this. I'm also trying to learn how to multitask, so forgive me.
And while you multitask, I will say this, as much as I love MCSS, NERC, NCSS, name the National Association for Multicultural Education, their website also is a wealth of resources. And I think you'll find no short supply of book recommendations, articles, and then also some of the leading thinkers in the field who can really speak to what it is that would help your faculty and your learning community better equip themselves to know about the theory and think about the practice.
Do you have any upcoming talks, other workshops that you're planning in the coming months?
Yeah, so I did not want to do, well, me as an individual or me as a—
In general, but including yourself.
Yeah, so I have been focusing more so on the program work at Primary Source, and this Wednesday we actually have a webinar featuring Harvard Kennedy School professor Tim McCarthy, who's looking at how we can queer history, how to teach US history through an LGBTQ lens. And what I'm really excited about that talk in particular is he's not just saying, and here's what that unit looks like. Here's how to tack on some queer studies at the end of your US history. His approach is going to be, how can the teaching of US history be fundamentally about queering the classroom experience? So that's coming up on this Wednesday. You can go to the Primary Source website, primarysource.org, to see some more information about that. And then, yeah, I'm just going to say we have at primarysource.org, you'll be able to see all of our upcoming fall programs. There's a bunch that are related to voting rights and voting history. On October 24th, there's a virtual program. It's free. It's funded by Mass Humanities, and that's about, voting rights history. And again, we're using an intersectional lens. So we have, as our keynote, professor at UMass Amherst in their African American Studies Department, Dr. John Bracey, who's speaking about Black women and their struggles for the franchise. It's, taking the discourse around women and voting rights and African Americans and voting rights and looking at that subset within both communities. He's going to be our keynote, but we're also partnering with Mass Historical Society and the Collaborative for Educational Services out in Northampton. And we're going to be running sessions that also look at the anti-suffrage movement in Boston. So who were these prominent women in Boston who were opposed to the expansion of voting rights? And then we're also going to be looking at disability history in the context of voting rights and voting history. So those are just a couple of things that come to mind, but we have our full program card on the website. And then personally, I'm currently in the throes of a couple of book projects. So in 2021, I'll probably have those actually published, and that will determine my speaking slate for 2021.
That's great.
Yeah.
You can say you don't have much downtime.
Gorman, you and my wife should get together and figure out how to get me to do more kayaking and less reading and writing.
Oh, wow. No, this is great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For,
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
yeah, and like I said, his email is on the chat, and also there is a link to the feedback survey for this particular session. You can fill out this survey as soon as we disembark on this meeting, or you can, if you are planning to see a number of other keynote speeches tomorrow. You can do the survey all at once at the by tomorrow, so it will be open for you. This session has been recorded. It's on Facebook Live right now, and it will stay on our Facebook page. But yeah, thank you so much. It's a great way to end the first day of NERCVirtual. So yeah, now you can enjoy the remaining day.
Right.
But
thank you so much, Gorman.
Thank you. All right. Have a great day, everyone. All right. Good night.